Right, I'm going for props rather than a PowerPoint, and going for the rockstar mic. Um, Tēnā koutou katoa, he mihi mahana kia koutou I runga I te kaupapa o tēnei rā. I'm honored and delighted to share in the kaupapa of this day with all of you, the body of knowledge that we're creating together. But before I tell you about my research, I want to just acknowledge and thank my husband here, Dr. Richard Sorensen. Richard and I met at Princeton when we were both PhD students back in the 1980s. And Richard was writing his PhD thesis on the history of the Royal Society in the 18th century. So the Royal Society, the one over there in London, has been a part of my life for a very long time. And I've got to say that back then, I would never, ever have expected that I would be part of the Royal Society, because my kaupapa is very different. My academic taranga waiwai is poetry, a very different form of knowledge creation than science. So while Richard was doing his PhD in the history of science, I was studying comparative literature, modernist poetry in English, German, and French. So these are poets from the period roughly between and including the two world wars, a time when writers and artists were experimenting with new language, new modes of representation, to try to express the complexity and the chaos of the modern world that they found themselves in. And the Victorian and Edwardian tropes that they had inherited, they felt were just not fit for purpose anymore. And so they had to do what the poet Ezra Pound said. His mantra was, make it new. And so that became my mantra as well. As a modernist scholar, I was always trying to cast new light on the poets that I studied and the culture, the cultural period that I studied. And then I started teaching, and I realized that that top-down lecturing method that had been my kind of cultural inheritance as a student was not fit for purpose if I wanted my students to become creative and innovative thinkers. So I had to make it new as a teacher. So over the next 15 years or so, I wrote books and articles not just on modernist literature, but also on higher education pedagogy, educational development. I also became interested in digital poetics. So the ways that poets of the 21st century were making it new using digital technologies. And then at some point, all of these various interests kind of came together into a new constellation. So thinking about language and teaching and learning and communication and innovation, creativity, all of these things led me into doing what I've done for most of the last 2 decades now, really, which is writing about academic writing, doing research on the language of academic research. So I came out of that disciplinary silo to this kind of pan-disciplinary perspective, which is, it's a really interesting place to be, but also kind of a lonely one, because there is no disciplinary society for doing this kind of meta-research. There is no Marsden Code. Presents its own challenges. But it's been a great ride. It's been fascinating. So it started quite modestly, actually, with this little book called The Writer's Diet. And I wrote this basically because I was trying to find kind of a heuristic and a metaphor to help my students, and also, I must say, some of my colleagues, simply to write sentences that were verb-driven, active, concrete, clear, concise. You know, that's how we want to be putting our knowledge, our research into the world. And yet I found that so many of them seemed to think that they were supposed to, or didn't know any alternative, but to write sentences that were actually abstract, passive, agentless, long-winded, wooden, wordy, turgid. I'm sure none of this applies to anybody in this room, but we all know what I'm talking about, right? So writing that book led me to a much more substantial project, which was this one called Stylish Academic Writing, which was published by a Harvard University Press in 2012. And with this book, I was basically trying to just demonstrate that the title of the book does not need to be an oxymoron, that it is actually possible, and indeed I would say urgent and imperative, for academics to convey their research in a way that is engaging and human. And for this book, I found then exemplars from the sciences, the social sciences, the arts and humanities to show that it is possible to write in that way and to try to give people the tools and the inspiration for doing that. But I came to realize that writing like that is hard if you've never learned it. It requires confidence. It requires craft skills, so you do need to learn. It requires courage if writing like that means pushing against the conventions of a discipline or the norms of a discipline that make you feel where you've never seen any exemplars like that, and you think you're supposed to write in that other way. So by the time I finished this book, it became clear to me that even though I was a literary scholar by training, I was going to have to lift my gaze from the words on the page to the people who put them there. So that led to the next book, also published by Harvard, Air and Light in Time and Space, How Successful Academics Write. And so for this book, I interviewed 100 successful, I'm doing scare quotes here, successful academic writers with success quite broadly defined. I also collected questionnaire data from over 1,200 research academics, postdocs, PhD students across the disciplines and around the world. And I asked them a number of questions about their writing. I wanted to know how they learned to write in their discipline for a start. The answer basically from more than half of them was, well, I didn't. Sink or swim. I wanted to know how they developed resilience to deal with peer review and rejection. I wanted to know about their daily writing habits, or their writing habits if they had any. And I also asked them about their emotions. So I asked, what are the main emotions that you associate with your academic writing? And the academics in the room might ask yourselves how you would answer that question. So for the questionnaire respondents, this big group of people, the number one academic emotion was frustration, followed by anxiety. But for the 100 successful academic writers, these hand-picked writers that I interviewed, the picture was very different. The emotion word that they expressed most often was pleasure, followed by enjoyment. But this wasn't a simple, happy dancing through the daisies, oh, I love writing because it's so easy and fun kind of pleasure. It was a much more complex, kind of richer pleasure. They said, yeah, writing is frustrating. Writing is hard. Writing is challenging. That's why I enjoy it. The challenge and the pleasure go hand in hand. The challenge of the craft is part of the pleasure. And so I went looking for, other books, writers, people who had talked about the relationship between productivity and pleasure, the importance and value of cultivating pleasure in academic writing. And I found almost nothing. So that was the next book, which I started researching about 6 years ago, and it just came out last month. writing with pleasure. And I'm quite proud that this was published by Princeton University Press as part of their Skills for Scholars series. So that's Princeton saying writing with pleasure is an important scholarly skill. And with this book, I really feel like my whole career has kind of come full circle. It is very much an academic book. It's got all the apparatus, years of research, the footnotes, all those things, but it's also got poetry in it. It's got language play. It's got stories. It's got 40 line drawings by my friend and colleague and fellow, Selena Tustala-Marsh. So it's trying to both write about and kind of enact a pleasure in writing that I hope will bring pleasure to readers as well. So I want to thank Te Aparangi for recognizing what I do as research and for also expanding our definition, our understanding of what counts as knowledge, knowledge production, and research. Thank you.
Questions? Oh, hands are already up.
Sorry. Hi. So as a poet, what kind of space do you see for poetry, both literal poems and evocation and metaphor and imagery, within science writing specifically and academic, like research writing?
Thank you. Great question. Well, what I've learned over the years is that a lot of scientists think very poetically. A lot of science writing happens through metaphor. And what I've also learned from the work I do now, because I run a lot of workshops and online courses and things like that for, sorry, getting out of your view, for academics in many different disciplines. And when scientists or any kind of writer are invited to kind of come to their writing and their ideas through poetic exercises, it's amazing what they come up with. Just amazing. So poetry, even just as a form of thinking your way into science, I think is a really great methodology and one that people really respond to. Could a scientist put a poem into a scientific article? Absolutely, and I could find you citations where people have done that. Is it common? No. Is it risky? Yes. Is it going to work in every kind of science journal? No, of course not. But I think we really can open up our ideas. And in fact, Cather used to invite poets into her physics courses, I know, because I've been there. So I think if you want a collaboration between science and poetry, have a chat with us, actually. We've been there. Thanks.
Thanks, Helen. I'm an academic who loves writing, and I love your work on writing. And, you know, one of the things that I think people often imagine is that it's the last bit, or it's and don't give enough time to it, right? Like writing takes time and takes space, and so I guess in a very pressured academic context, how do you have any sort of suggestions for key messages for how to give writing itself enough time?
Thank you. Great question. And I loved your talk earlier, by the way, because we're in the sisterhood of meta research, right? Yeah. Yeah, people always ask me, how do I become a more efficient writer, as in write really well but more quickly? And I say, when you find out, please let me know. One of the biggest revelations for me as part of my work looking at kind of productivity in writing, that side of things, was how slow I am and how slow I am going to remain. And so what that meant for me was, first of all, shifting the way I thought about it. So instead of beating myself up and saying, oh, I'm so slow, something's wrong with me, shifting that and saying, well, I'm a very craft-focused writer. I put my time in at the craft end, and then I send things out and they have a very high acceptance rate because they're well crafted. Somebody else may be using their time differently. So validating doing that, but also the way I then, the way I plan my projects and my writing time is all about making as much time as possible because I know I need it. So it's given me kind of a different relationship to time. And so I always just encourage people to try to figure out what kind of writer they are, because there's no one way, and then to work from there. If you're a slow writer, try to see that as your superpower, and then make the time for that rather than maybe for the editing stages where you maybe don't need as much time as somebody else would.
Kia ora, Helen, that was great. We've been doing a number of projects, and Linda Smith has taken the research findings and written 5 children's books. So I'm really interested in your views around us actually providing writing that takes our findings beyond an adult audience.
Well, I think that's assuming, first of all, that only adults are going to read those children's books. And you only have to talk to my friend Selena Tusitala-Marsh to find that when you write for children, you're writing for everybody. So it's about telling stories. But absolutely, what more important? To be able to, and I would say that for anybody here, to communicate science or anything that we do to children in a compelling and interesting way. They are the scientists of the future, the knowledge producers of the future. So, I think anything we can do to expand our thinking about where our research can go and the modes of writing and expression that might take it there, it's going to be good for everybody. It's going to be good for us as thinkers, I'd like to say, too. If you have to write about your research project as a children's book, whoever you are, you will learn from doing that. You will learn a ton, and you'll learn from what the kids have to say, too, I'll bet. So sounds like a great project. Kia ora.
Thank you very much. I'm really sorry we do have to close it down, but you're staying for drinks, right? Helen? Yes? So we can talk at the cocktail